The skeleton of a porch roof, bleached by 100 Wyoming summers, was the first thing Silas Blackwood noticed. It was a ruin he'd ridden past a dozen times on his way to the high pastures, the old Miller homestead, long since surrendered to dust and drought. The place was a ghost, a testament to a family that had tried and failed. But this time, something was different. A patch of light brown fabric lay huddled against the clapboard wall, too soft to be wood, too still to be a coyote seeking shade. He reined in his black stallion, Titan, the creak of saddle leather loud in the vast, hot silence of 1878. Silas Blackwood was a man who preferred silence. It was a commodity he'd bought and paid for with 10 years of back-breaking work that had, by some miracle of geology and luck, turned a worthless tract of land into the richest silver strike in the territory. Now, he owned most of the valley, a quiet kingdom where his word was law because his coin paid for everything. Wealth had bought him solitude, but it had also built a wall around him, each dollar another stone. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the fine, pale dust. As he drew closer, the patch of brown resolved into a thin blanket, and beneath it, a sliver of grey silk and a bare foot, smudged with dirt. He stopped. It was a girl, curled into the smallest possible space, seeking refuge in a place that offered none. She was Chinese, her black hair a stark contrast against the weathered wood of the porch. Her dress, a traditional cheongsam, was tattered at the hem and stained with the grime of travel. She couldn't have been more than 18. Silas was not a man given to impulse. His success was built on careful calculation and a deep-seated mistrust of anything that couldn't be weighed or measured. A girl like this, alone and unprotected, was a problem. A problem that could attach itself to him, could become a debt of a kind he couldn't pay with gold. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to ride on. He had 1,000 head of cattle to worry about and a meeting with the railroad surveyor in Cheyenne next week. He had no place for this. He took a step back toward his horse. But then, the girl stirred in her sleep, a small sigh escaping her lips, a sound of such profound exhaustion that it snagged on something deep inside him. He saw the slight tremor in her hand where it clutched the edge of the blanket. She was not a problem. She was a person. And this was his land. Not this specific ruined plot, perhaps, but the miles of grazing that surrounded it were his. In a way, that made her his responsibility. He sighed, the sound a low rumble of resignation in his chest. He could not leave her here to be found by sun, or wolves, or worse, by men less burdened by conscience. He walked onto the porch, the old boards groaning under his weight. He knelt, his shadow falling over her. "Miss," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Her eyes flew open. They were dark and wide with an immediate, animal terror. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall, the blanket falling away to reveal the worn grey silk of her dress. She said nothing, just watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. She was like a cornered deer, ready to bolt, even with nowhere to run. "I'm not going to hurt you," Silas said, keeping his voice low and even. He held up his hands, palms open, to show he meant no harm. "You're on the old Miller place. It's not safe out here." She still didn't speak, her gaze darting from his face to the big horse standing patiently behind him, then back again. He could see the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the quick assessment of threat. "Do you have a name?" he asked gently. She hesitated for a long moment, her throat working. "And Lynn," she whispered. The name was a puff of air, almost lost to the wind. Silas Blackwood, he gestured vaguely to the mountains around them. "My ranch is a few miles west. You can have shelter there." "Food?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of suspicion replacing the fear. In her world, nothing was given for free. An offer of help from a strange man was often the preamble to a demand. "No payment," he added, guessing the direction of her thoughts. "Just a roof and a meal. You can't stay here." And Lynn looked at the crumbling porch, then at the vast, empty horizon. She had been walking for 2 days since her father had shut the door of their small shack in the railroad camp, his face a mask of shame and fury. He had a gambling debt to a foreman, a cruel man named Ballo, and he had tried to offer his daughter as settlement. When she refused, he had cast her out with nothing but the clothes on her back. This ruin was the first shelter she had found. It was a poor thing, but it was hers. But she knew Silas Blackwood was right. The sun was a hammer, and the nights were cold. She had no food, no water. Her defiance had bought her freedom, but it was a freedom that would kill her if she stayed here. She gave a single, sharp nod. Silas stood and walked back to Titan, retrieving a canteen from his saddle. He returned and offered it to her. She took it with trembling hands, her fingers brushing his. He felt the slight, cool touch like a spark. She drank deeply, the water spilling down her chin. When she handed it back, their eyes met for a second longer than necessary. He saw not just fear, but a flicker of fierce, guarded pride. She was not broken. Whatever had brought her to this porch, it had not broken her. And Silas knew, with a certainty that defied all his careful calculations, that his life had just become significantly more complicated. The arrival of Lynn at the main ranch house was met with a stunned silence from his staff. Mrs. Gable, his stout and formidable housekeeper, stood on the veranda with a dish rag in her hand, her mouth a perfect O of surprise as Silas helped the small, barefoot Chinese girl down from his horse. "Mrs. Gable," Silas said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "this is Lynn. She will be staying with us. Find her a room. And some clothes. And a bath." Mrs. Gable's eyes flickered over Lynn's tattered cheongsam and dirty feet, but she was a woman who had worked for Silas for 10 years. She knew the finality in his voice. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her professionalism snapping back into place. "This way, dear." And Lynn looked at Silas, a question in her eyes. He gave her a slight nod of reassurance, and she followed the housekeeper into the sprawling ranch house, a place grander than any she had ever imagined. The next few days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. And Lynn was a ghost in the house, silent and watchful. She wore the simple calico dresses Mrs. Gable provided, which hung loosely on her slender frame. She ate her meals in the kitchen, refusing to join Silas in the cavernous dining room. He would see her sometimes in the garden, her hands gently tending the wilting rose bushes, or watching the ranch hands work the horses in the corral, her expression unreadable. She spoke little, but her presence was a constant, low hum in the background of his life. The trouble, when it came, started in the town of Covenant, as Silas knew it would. Covenant existed because of his silver and his cattle. He owned the bank, held the mortgage on the general store, and paid the wages that fed most of the families. But that did not mean he owned their opinions. He had ridden into town for supplies, with Lynn sitting beside him on the wagon seat. It was the first time she had left the ranch since her arrival. She was quiet, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes taking in the dusty street and the false-fronted buildings. People stopped and stared. Whispers followed them like burrs on a saddle blanket. Silas ignored them, his jaw set. He was inside the general store, negotiating a price for a dozen barrels of salted pork, when Jedediah Croft entered. Croft was a man who had grown fat on other people's misfortunes. He controlled the only independent freighting company in the region and had been a thorn in Silas's side for years, always looking for an angle, a point of leverage. "Blackwood," Croft said, his voice slick with false cordiality. He was a large man, his bulk spilling over the top of his straining waistcoat. "I see you've taken up a new hobby." He glanced pointedly through the window at the wagon, where Lynn sat waiting, a small, still figure against the vastness of the landscape. "My affairs are my own, Croft," Silas said, not turning from the storekeeper. "Are they?" Croft moved to stand beside him, lowering his voice. "Some might say bringing that kind into a decent town is everyone's affair. People are talking. It's not a good look for a man of your standing." "I'm not concerned with my look," Silas replied, his voice dangerously soft. "Finish tallying the order, Mr. Henderson." But Croft wasn't done. He was a dog with a bone. "I heard she was squatting out on the old Miller place. You know there's an outstanding lien on that property. A legal entanglement." Silas turned then, his eyes cold. The Miller place is worthless and has been for 20 years. What's your point? My point, Croft said, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face, is that everything has a price. And everyone has a weakness. You'd be wise to remember that. He tipped his hat and sauntered out, leaving a trail of cheap cigar smoke and malice in his wake. Silas finished his business, his mind racing. Croft wasn't just making a casual threat. The mention of a lien on the Miller property was a specific, deliberate shot across his bow. He was testing Silas, probing for a soft spot. When he returned to the wagon, he saw two of Croft's freight hands loitering nearby, leering at Lynn. They were drunk, their laughter coarse. Look what the cat dragged in, one of them slurred, stepping closer to the wagon. You lost, little girl. And Lynn didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if they weren't there. Her stillness seemed to infuriate them more than any scream would have. Maybe she don't speak English, the other one said, reaching for the side of the wagon. Maybe we ought to teach her. Before the man's hand could touch the wood, Silas was there. He didn't run, he moved with a fluid, deadly speed that was startling in a man his size. He grabbed the man's wrist, his grip like iron. The freighter's face went pale, his drunken bravado vanishing in a flash of pain. I think your business is elsewhere, Silas said, his voice a low growl. He twisted his hand just slightly, and the man gasped, dropping to his knees. The second man hesitated, looking from his friend on the ground to Silas's cold, unblinking eyes. He saw something there that sobered him instantly. He backed away, pulling his friend with him. No trouble, Mr. Blackwood. We were just leaving. Silas released the man's wrist and they scurried away like rats. He climbed back onto the wagon seat without a word. He flicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving Covenant and its hostile stares behind. They rode in silence for a mile. The sun beat down, and the air was thick with dust. Silas could feel the tension radiating from the small figure beside him. He had thought to protect her by bringing her into his world, but he had only succeeded in painting a target on her back. He did not yet know that the worthless deed to a ruined ranch was about to become the most dangerous weapon in Croft's arsenal. That evening, the silence in the grand house felt heavier than usual. Silas sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk, the account ledgers open but unread. Croft's words echoed in his mind. A legal entanglement. It was a threat, cloaked in the language of the law, and it was aimed directly at Lynn. He had made her vulnerable by sheltering her. He heard a soft knock on the door. Come in, he said. And Lynn entered, carrying a small tray with a pot of tea and a single cup. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed to fill the large, masculine room with a strange sense of peace. She set the tray on the corner of his desk and poured the tea, the fragrant steam rising in the lamplight. Mrs. Gable said you did not come for supper, she said, her voice soft. It was the most she had said to him all day. I wasn't hungry, he replied, his eyes fixed on her hands as she handled the porcelain. They were steady, her movements deliberate. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. Those men in town. They work for the one who spoke to you, it wasn't a question. Yes. He is a bad man, she stated simply. Silas took a sip of the tea. It was jasmine, fragrant and calming. He is a man who wants what I have. He wants to use me to hurt you, she said, her gaze unwavering. She saw the truth of the situation with a clarity that startled him. She was not naive. She had been surviving men like Croft her entire life. I won't let him, Silas said, the words a vow. She was quiet for a long moment, tracing the rim of the teacup with her finger. My father, she began, her voice barely a whisper, he is a merchant in the railroad camps. He sells goods to the workers. He is not a strong man. He likes to gamble. Silas listened, not moving, giving her the space her story required. He made a promise. To a foreman, a cruel man. For a debt she finally looked up, and he saw a flicker of the same fire he'd seen on the porch that first day. I would not be the payment. So he told me I was no longer his daughter. The simple, brutal honesty of it hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't a cast-off. She was a woman of principle who had chosen destitution over dishonor. He had offered her shelter, thinking her a victim. He was beginning to understand she was a survivor. She reached into the pocket of the simple dress and pulled out a small object. She placed it on the desk between them. It was a piece of jade, carved into the shape of a butterfly, worn smooth with time. "It was my mother's," she said. "It is all I have of her. It is supposed to bring fortune." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Its power seems to have faded." "I don't think so," Silas said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He looked from the small, beautiful token to her face, illuminated by the warm glow of the lamp. "I think it brought you here." A comfortable silence settled between them, a new understanding that needed no more words. But the peace was shattered 3 days later by the sound of horses arriving at a gallop. Silas stepped onto the veranda to see Jedediah Croft dismounting, a smug look on his face. He was not alone. Beside him was a man with a tin star pinned to his vest, a U.S. Marshal. "Blackwood," Croft called out, his voice booming with authority. "We have a legal matter to discuss." Silas's hand instinctively went to the Colt holstered at his hip. "I have no business with you, Croft." "Oh, I think you do," Croft said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "This is a lawfully executed deed for the Miller homestead and the 100 acres surrounding it, filed with the Territorial Office last year. The property is mine." The marshal, a grim-faced man with tired eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. Croft has filed a complaint, Blackwood. Trespassing. He claims this girl," he said, the word dripping with distaste, "was on his land. He's here to claim his property. It was a trap, elegant in its cruelty." Croft wasn't just claiming the land, he was trying to claim Lynn as part of it, a trespasser he could deal with as he saw fit. In the eyes of the law, especially a law wielded by a man like Croft, she had no rights. Lynn appeared in the doorway behind Silas, her face pale but her expression resolute. "She is under my protection," Silas said, his voice like stone. He moved to stand slightly in front of her. "Protection?" Croft laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "You have no legal standing here. The girl is a vagrant. A squatter on my land. I'm within my rights to have her removed. The marshal is here to see it's done." The marshal looked uncomfortable. "The law is the law, Blackwood. If the deed is valid." Silas knew the deed was likely fraudulent, a forgery bought and paid for. But proving that would take weeks, maybe months. By then, it would be too late. Croft would have Lynn, and he would disappear her into the brutal world of the railroad camps from which she had just escaped. He was cornered. Croft had used the law to create a lawless situation. Silas looked at Lynn. He saw the terror she was trying so hard to conceal. He saw the jade butterfly clutched in her hand. He thought of her quiet dignity, her refusal to be broken. He had a choice. He could fight, which would lead to bloodshed and likely get him arrested, leaving Lynn defenseless. Or he could do what he did best. He could use his money as a weapon. He let out a slow breath. "Fine," he said, his voice calm. The sudden change in his demeanor surprised both Croft and the marshal. "The land is yours, Croft. You have the paper to prove it. So I'll buy it from you." Croft blinked. "What?" "I'll buy the Miller place," Silas repeated, stepping down from the porch. "All 100 worthless acres. Name your price." Croft's mind worked furiously. This wasn't how he had planned it. He wanted the girl, the leverage, the humiliation of his rival. But the glint in Silas's eye was one he recognized, the look of a man about to close a deal. Greed warred with malice, and greed won. $10,000, Croft blurted out, the number absurd, fantastical for a piece of barren dirt and a collapsed shack. The marshal let out a low whistle. "Croft, that's robbery." "That's my price," Croft said, puffing out his chest. "Done," Silas said without a moment's hesitation. He turned to the marshal. You'll witness the transaction. I'll have the cash brought from my safe. We'll draw up the bill of sale right now. Croft's jaw went slack. He had never imagined Silas would call his bluff. $10,000 was a fortune, but to Silas, it was just paper. He was buying something far more valuable. He was buying her safety. He was making a public declaration, in front of a federal officer, that Lynn was not for sale, not at any price. The cost was more than just the money. The story would be all over the territory by week's end, Silas Blackwood, the shrewd millionaire, paying a king's ransom for a worthless plot of land to protect a Chinese girl. It would make him look like a fool. It would make him a target. He didn't care. As he turned back to the house, he caught Lynn's eye. The look of stunned, dawning gratitude in her face was worth more than all the silver in his mountain. 6 months later, the Wyoming winter had settled its white blanket over the valley. The air was crisp and clean, and the sound of hammers echoed in the cold. The old Miller homestead was no longer a ruin. A new, sturdy cabin stood in its place, made of fresh-cut pine that smelled sharp and sweet. The porch was rebuilt, the roof solid. And Lynn stood directing 2 of Silas's ranch hands as they carefully fitted a glass window into its frame. She wore a warm wool coat over her dress and sturdy leather boots. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her voice was clear and confident as she gave instructions. She had overseen every detail of the rebuilding, her quiet efficiency and eye for structure impressing everyone. The project, and the land, had become hers. Silas rode up on Titan, dismounting near the porch. He no longer looked at this place as a ruin, but as a beginning. The $10,000 he had paid Croft had become a local legend, but the tide of public opinion had turned in a way he hadn't expected. Croft's blatant greed had exposed him, and when Silas's lawyers in Cheyenne later proved the original lien was a complete fabrication, Croft's freighting business had crumbled under the weight of his ruined reputation. "The last window," Silas said, joining her on the new porch. "It will be good to have the light in the mornings," she replied, a soft smile on her face. She looked at the cabin with a deep sense of ownership. "It is a good house." "It is," he agreed. In the month since the confrontation with Croft, the walls between them had slowly come down. They had spent evenings talking, not of the past, but of the future. Of cattle breeds and crop rotations, of the best place to dig a new well. He discovered in her a keen mind for business and a pragmatism that matched his own. She was his partner in a way no one had ever been. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small jade butterfly. He had been keeping it for her. He held it out on his palm. "I believe this belongs to you." She looked at the carving, then up at him. "I think," she said softly, "it has found its home." She didn't take it. Instead, she placed her hand over his, her small, warm fingers curling around his calloused ones, covering the butterfly. They stood there for a long moment on the porch of the house that they had built together, their hands joined, the silence comfortable and full of unspoken promises. The world had seen a millionaire cowboy and a lost Chinese girl. But on a rebuilt homestead in the heart of Wyoming, they had simply found each other. And they knew, with a quiet certainty that needed no words, that they were finally home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.